I learned early that the people who speak the least in a room are the ones who can afford to. Silence is a kind of currency in American upper-class charity circles, more liquid than applause, more versatile than a photo on a donor wall. I was good at silence. I let other people cut ribbons, take pictures, announce six-figure pledges like auctioneers discovering their own generosity. I preferred to arrive before the cameras, to sign what needed signing, to keep the lights on, the payroll steady, the after-school vans fueled even when the press release forgot to mention fuel at all. I never needed them to say thank you. I only needed them to keep their promises. The first promise I ever funded was small enough to fit in a plastic binder, a scholarship for 5 students from a public high school that looked across at the city and saw a skyline it was never invited to inhabit. I wrote the proposal myself at my kitchen table, a chipped white surface that had once supported my mother's elbows while she graded papers. She died before she could see me become the man who could give other teachers enough supplies to stop rationing chalk. That was a private vow. You do not boast about what you owe your dead. By the time my relatives learned to pronounce the name of my donor-advised fund without glancing at my lapel pin for hints, the annual gala had become the kind of scene that makes magazines forgive a dull month. A Beaux-Arts ballroom on Fifth, a vaulted ceiling gold-leafed within an inch of its ego, winter roses heavy as secrets in glass cylinders, violins rehearsing by pretending not to. My relatives were beautiful in the way wealth makes even indifference a flattering color. They called themselves a legacy family, as if generosity were a surname that could be inherited, notarized, and displayed in a frame. They liked their charity photogenic, grants that glowed, programs that could be described in 3 words and hashtagged into impact. Arts, kids, cancer. They weren't wrong. Cameras like uncomplicated compassion. But they also liked control. And control is allergic to people who don't require attention to keep breathing. I ran a logistics firm in the shadow of the city's larger myths, a lattice of warehouses, trucks, and software that made things appear precisely where they were needed, and almost never where they weren't. It was an unglamorous empire, built on the patient magic of timetables. That discipline followed me into philanthropy. I read budgets the way some men read wine lists. I remembered which director had a habit of rounding up their hourly staffing to close the gap. I knew which program. Reports were written by committee and which were written at midnight by a exhausted program manager trying to keep a promise. To a child whose bus pass had expired, my relatives preferred galas over audits. Their board meetings were rehearsals for the toast. At those meetings, I sat at the far end, close enough to see the slide deck pixel by pixel, far enough to signal that I didn't need a speaking part. Caroline, my cousin, chaired most of them with the choreographed warmth of someone who had learned her empathy on a teleprompter. Her husband, Pierce, had perfected a smile that looked like a hard stop. My Aunt Lillian, our matriarch by vote and by volume, broke ties when diplomacy failed. They talked about elevating the brand, curating donor experiences, aligning the narrative. They said impact so often it lost its weight. I said less and signed more. And then there were the small yearly donations, the ones I never brought up because real gifts aren't measured by their press. I funded the maintenance on a school's boiler one December when the city remembered it had weather. I paid for dental vans in March because poverty starts in the mouth. And braver reporters than our local society pages had written that sentence already. I put $5,000 into a quietly heroic reading clinic whose director sent me emails that sounded like field notes from a war in which the first casualty is a child's willingness to try again. 5,000 is not a headline. 5,000 keeps the lights on. If you want to understand my relationship with my relatives, imagine a watch whose face is polished and whose gears are never mentioned. They were the face. I was the movement. I wasn't naive. People who prefer backstage entrances are still people. I knew I wanted something from our charity's world that I would never admit at a microphone. I wanted it to be honest, at least in the ways honesty was possible when donors are also actors in their own legends. I wanted us to fund what worked, not what photographed well. I wanted them to keep their promises, so I wouldn't have to keep making up for their appetite's effect on their memory. On a gray Tuesday, 5 weeks before the winter gala, I arrived at the Midtown office with coffee I didn't drink because it tasted like consensus. The halls smelled faintly of lemon polish and desperation disguised as mint. Caroline's assistant, a sleek bone structure attached to a calendar, offered me a smile as thin as a receipt. "They've started without you," she said, even though the agenda said 10 and the clock said 9:58. When I walked in, the conference table had been laid out like a charcuterie board of control. Printed packets, place cards, a centerpiece of white peonies apparently purchased from a store that sold them by the adjective. Caroline stood at the head of the table with a slide glowing behind her. Gala 24, a night to remember. She did not look at me when she said my name. "Ah, there you are. We're just covering sponsorship tiers." Her voice belonged to someone who never had to explain a bill. I took my seat and let the chair accept my weight, like an oath. Pierce clicked to the next slide. Logos appeared, some I recognized, some I didn't. I recognized mine where it was not. My donor-advised fund was missing from presenting sponsor. In its place was a tech firm that had never once shown up to tour a program without a camera crew. I said nothing. The silence left room for other people to hang themselves on it. "We've restructured," Pierce said, as if talking about furniture. "The presenting slot aligns better with the new audience strategy." "New audience," Aunt Lillian echoed, because repetition is how some people convince themselves they are making a point. I looked down at the packet placed in front of my name. Inside, a letter I had not been sent electronically explained that because of limited seating and intimate program flow, we would be strongly encouraging foundational donors to enjoy the program virtually. I turned the letter over and discovered the back was blank, the way courtesies often are. To understand why I didn't speak then, you'd need to know two more things. First, their charity wasn't just their charity. The family foundation, whose seed money paid for the first student scholarship. The one I built into an endowment that quietly outperformed every braggart's portfolio year after year. That foundation had 2 trustees. For 15 years, my aunt and I shared that duty. She decorated checks. I read covenants. There are stipulations and thresholds and phrases like best effort that are soft enough to be manipulated and hard enough to set teeth if you bite down. I kept those phrases honest. Second, they had mistaken quiet for weak for so long that the mistake had acquired squatters' rights in their heads. It is not easy to persuade someone that the person they have dismissed is, in fact, the system that keeps their illusions from falling off the wall. Caroline glided through the agenda as if it had already been archived as a triumph. Now, operational metrics. We've expanded the VIP lounge concept. This year's activation will tell a story of hope. We'll transform the mezzanine into a journey narrative. Entry, challenge, transformation, impact, like a hero's. Journey, Pierce said, bathing in his own education. Exactly, Caroline replied. And on the main floor, we'll place the donor names in a new constellation wall. It's interactive. Guests can find themselves among the stars. She tried on a smile that did not belong to her, and then kept it because she liked the way it looked. Aunt Lillian tapped a pen against her folder. What about what did we call it last time? Programmatic uglies? Operational burdens, Pierce corrected. We're streamlining. We're moving unrestricted gifts to a general fund, so the onstage story isn't cluttered. Cluttered, Aunt Lillian repeated, as if the word had just saved a child. The onstage story. That phrase sat on the table between us like a napkin no one could claim. My donor-advised fund had always operated on a different principle: on-the-ground truth. You fund the tutoring hours because without them, the dramatic video of a graduate shaking a dean's hand is a well-lit lie. You pay for the unphotographable because it's the only thing that isn't pretending to be something else. And the school-based reading clinic, I said finally, the words even and polished. Where are they in the constellation? Caroline blinked, as if someone had spoken across the stage during rehearsal. We've decided to consolidate smaller grants into a new story. A brighter one. A brighter story, Aunt Lillian mused, then said it again in case the first attempt had not made it real. I closed the folder and placed it squarely in front of me. The paper made a sound like a decision. After the meeting, Pierce caught up with me in the hallway. He walked like a man who had rehearsed the end of a scene and couldn't wait to deliver the line he thought would win him a nomination. "You know how this is," he said. "We love the nuts and bolts, but this is a gala. We have to speak to the moment." "I thought we were speaking to children who need to read," I said. He laughed, genial, with teeth, always with the earnestness. "Look, you'll have your table, of course, and the video team can slot you for a cutaway during the paddle raise. But the presenting level is evolving. New audiences, new energy." "My table," I said. The letter in my folder had said otherwise. "Well," he said, smoothing his tie the way some men pet themselves to feel brave. "Limited seating this year. We're doing more fluid mingling. We know you're not big on events, so we thought you'd be more comfortable watching the live stream from your, what do you call it, your warehouse command center." He smiled as if he'd told an inside joke I would be grateful to hear. Besides, some of the other donors felt uncomfortable. "Uncomfortable," I said. "With the smallness," he said. "The little gifts you make all year. It confuses the public story. People they might think those are the level of gifts we celebrate. And then, where are we?" I had never wanted a drink in the middle of the day until that moment. And even then what I wanted wasn't alcohol. I wanted cold water, and an empty room and a pen that worked the first time. I wanted to be alone with the ledger of all the ways we had learned to lie to ourselves. On my way out, I passed the donor wall, a galaxy of glass stars with names etched in money. The lobby smelled like orange oil and the memory of winter coats. Outside, taxis slid along the curb with the obedience of trained animals. Midtown does not stop for your revelation. That night I sat at my kitchen table, the newer one, walnut with a ribbon of lighter grain down the middle like a scar, and opened the foundation files. I keep them as neatly as other people keep photographs. My laptop was warm under my wrists. The heat clicked in the baseboards. People mistake quiet rooms for empty ones, but the room had weight. The weight of every promise we had made on letterhead. The weight of my mother's ghost, correcting commas in a grant proposal. The weight of a girl I had once watched sound out the word harbor, and then look up as if she had been granted a real one. In the folder labeled Covenants, I found the clause I remembered. Sponsorships are contingent upon narrative alignment with programmatic truth and minimum direct service allocation requirements. The language was mine, written years ago in a mood of stubborn idealism I'd been told would burn off like fog. It had not. We'd tucked it into the founding documents because the law recognizes the difference between theater and theater that moves a person from a crowded apartment to a place with a lock that works. I stared at the words until their shape returned. Then I clicked into the endowment performance reports. Numbers are immune to flattery. The endowment had grown. The donor-advised disbursements had been steady. The small grants, the ones Pierce had classified as little gifts, had done more measurable good than any ice sculpture in the history of our family. The next day, I went to the club because sometimes you need to see people where they feel invincible in order to measure the exact quantity of their illusions. The winter light made everything look expensively honest. Polished wood, brass fittings that pretended to be humble. men laughing like punctuation marks at the ends of their own stories. In the corner, Caroline and Aunt Lillian sat with a woman from the museum board who wore a brooch that looked like a small heraldic animal defending a gemstone. They did not notice me at first. People rarely notice the person who is going to decide how their evening ends. "Darling, it's not that we don't appreciate loyalty," Aunt Lillian was saying, "but there's loyalty and there's optics." He insists on these small gestures. They don't scale. They make us look like we're funding bake sales. "Besides," Caroline added, stirring her tea as if it needed to be convinced, "he's not presentable. Not really. There's a certain stiffness to him on stage. And his voice does that thing?" "Earnestness," Aunt Lillian supplied. "A diagnosis." They laughed gently, as if they were saving a bird from having to fly by, informing it that the sky was closed. I stepped forward then, because cruelty is uglier when it believes itself to be courteous. "If we're workshopping my defects," I said, "consider adding arrives early and reads contracts. It's not photogenic, but it does scale." They turned with identical expressions, the polite surprise of people who think their names are a password the world should recognize. A few words were said, the kind that make the air smell like perfume taking sides. Caroline stood to touch my arm, a gesture that had all the sincerity of a press release. "We were just talking strategy," she said. "Of course you were," I replied, and took my hand back as if it had discovered a splinter. Later that week, the email arrived. It contained the same euphemisms as the letter in my folder, now rendered in digital dignity. Due to overwhelming demand and a reimagined intimate format, the gala would prioritize new partnerships that open doors to unprecedented horizons. My attendance, should I wish to enjoy the program, would be best accomplished via the exclusive donor livestream. The phrase exclusive donor livestream did not know its own joke. I read it twice to confirm the insult was intentional and then forwarded it to my assistant with a note. "Please log for records. No response necessary." That evening, I went for a walk. The city smelled like it's winter, a recipe of exhaust and optimism that had never quite learned to get along. I passed the park, where the trees had been strung with lights that trembled when the wind exhaled. On a bench, an old man in a hat was reading a newspaper as if it were still the only way to know the truth. A bus hissed. Someone laughed. A door somewhere closed in a way that made me think of finality that hadn't yet learned to announce itself. When I reached my building, the doorman handed me a cream-colored envelope with my name embossed as if attention were a form of taxation. Inside was a formal notice from the board. Due to organizational revitalization, I would be rotated off the gala committee to make space for emerging voices. In the margin, in Aunt Lillian's hand, a note. "Hope you understand, dear. Visionaries must be nimble." I stood in the lobby and felt nothing. Not rage, not sorrow. An absence shaped like clarity. People imagine betrayal as a blow. In truth, it is often a door politely closed in your face by someone who has practiced the gesture. And then the quiet arrives, the expensive quiet of padded carpet and respectable lighting, and you understand that the door is an invitation. That night, I opened the file named Contingencies. I have one for everything that can break, including people. I read until the words in my head arrange themselves into a sentence you could not misinterpret. The next morning, Pierce sent a mass message to the board with a mock jovial subject line, "Countdown to Constellations." He invited us to share uplifting micro-stories for the program book. "Keep them short and shiny," he wrote. I thought about the reading clinic that would lose 2 instructors if the general fund swallowed their line item. I thought about the school boiler that would go cold if we were busy curating a mezzanine journey narrative. I thought about a girl sounding out harbor and then looking up like someone had just told her there was a map. I replied with 2 lines. First, received. Second, I won't be attending. Pierce answered within a minute, his speed a tell. Regretful. You'll be missed? He added a winking emoji because nothing says legacy like punctuation. Pretending to be charm, I closed my laptop and watched the city move past my window with the purposeful anonymity of a conveyor belt. On the glass, my reflection looked like a man who had done his part and been told the part was over. The thing about being told your part is over is that it frees you to choose a different script. The betrayal, when it finally performed itself without euphemism, did not happen in a boardroom. It arrived at my front door. A messenger delivered a box with my name on it, a piece of stagecraft I recognized from past years. The Donor Delight Kit, a curated collection of indulgences designed to prime generosity. Small batch chocolates, a candle labeled with a word like hope or rise, and, this year, a delicate glass ornament in the shape of a star with a slot for a name. Mine was blank. The card inside read, in embossed italics, "Find yourself among the stars." I turned the star over. On the back, a sticker. Please return with your RSVP to ensure proper placement on the constellation wall. It would have been easy to be angry then, but anger is noisy, and I have always preferred the instruments that do not need to announce their pitch. I placed the star back in its box, sealed it with the courtesy it had not earned, and set it beside the file where I keep the language that the law recognizes as real. In the privacy of my kitchen, I poured water into a glass and held it to the light. It looked like clarity. The thing about people who believe that money is a mirror is that they forget it can also be a lever. If you know where to place it, you can move the world 2 inches in the right direction. 2 inches is more than it sounds. I picked up my pen. The ink moved cleanly. There was a rival charity across town, less decorative, more honest, run by a woman who wrote her own emails and visited her programs without alerting a camera. Last year, when their van broke down, I sent a check outside of any gala. She had sent back a note with a typo in it. The typo had convinced me she meant it. The betrayal had presented itself. So had the invitation. I began to write. People expect betrayal to arrive like a storm, loud and unmistakable. In truth, it seeps in like cold through old windows. It doesn't announce itself. It just waits for you to stop pretending you don't feel it. The night after the donor box arrived with its blank star and scented candle, I sat at the long walnut table with no lights on. The city outside provided enough amber glows through glass, the occasional sweep of a car's headlights across the ceiling, as if someone were flipping through the pages of an unfinished story. My glass of water had gone warm. I hadn't noticed. My mind kept circling back to the same image. My relatives sitting at that conference table, congratulating each other on their narrative while quietly escorting me out of it. Memory doesn't always arrive in order. Sometimes it drops you somewhere unexpected and lets you walk from there. I found myself remembering a night 12 years earlier, long before the galas had become rituals of self-congratulation. The foundation's endowment was still modest then. The ballroom decor had involved folding chairs and tablecloths borrowed from the school cafeteria. A storm had blown in unexpectedly, collapsing half the tent outside. Caroline, younger then and less polished, had panicked. The caterer was stuck in traffic. Donors were arriving in dripping coats, their hair plastered like wilted petals. I'd been the one to reroute the trucks, to call the restaurant across the street and order enough hot food to keep people from noticing how wet their shoes were. I'd quietly had maintenance pull folding dividers to section off the damaged area, repositioned lights, and redirected guests, as if that had been the plan all along. By the time Caroline took the stage with her gracious smile, the room looked like resilience. She got the applause, I got a nod, and I'd been fine with that. At the time, I remembered another night, a board meeting that ran long, a proposal for a literacy initiative that no one wanted to read past the executive summary. Caroline had pushed for a new museum wing partnership because it was photogenic. Pierce had agreed because tech money was circling it. Aunt Lillian had invoked optics. I had stayed behind afterward, lights off, reading the proposal from beginning to end. There had been a photograph at the end, grainy, black and white, of a classroom in disrepair. A note scrawled by a teacher. They need to read before they can dream. I'd signed the grant myself the next morning. No gala, no speech. Months later, a child from that classroom had sent me a thank you card with phonetic spelling. I'd kept it in my desk, not out of sentimentality, but because it reminded me what the numbers were supposed to mean. Those memories arrived uninvited, laying themselves out in a timeline I hadn't asked to see. Loyalty, after all, is just a collection of choices that look smaller than they are when you make them. I opened the Foundation archives again. Years of transfers, grants, reports, each line was a breadcrumb leading back to a moment when I'd chosen the quiet way. I'd signed checks while they gave speeches. I'd defended budgets when they weren't in the room. I'd written clauses to protect integrity while they perfected the art of plausible deniability. And over time, I told myself that it didn't matter who stood in the spotlight, as long as the work got done. But betrayal has a way of turning that quiet into an accusation. The same silence that once felt like strength now echoed like neglect. I walked through my apartment, lights still off. The place was spare, deliberate, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, leather chair by the corner where I read reports, bookshelves filled with contracts, history, strategy, not a single family portrait on the walls. I'd never felt the need. Family, for me, had been a function of shared responsibility, not shared smiles. But that night, the absence of their faces felt like a prediction I'd written years earlier without realizing it. In the kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator was steady, indifferent. I leaned against the counter and let the sound fill the room. It reminded me of the trucks at night in the loading bays, those hours when the city sleeps and the real work gets done. That was always my place, behind the scenes, moving the world 2 inches while other people practiced their acceptance speeches. The humiliation didn't arrive as a single event. It layered itself like dust you didn't notice accumulating until you ran a finger across the surface and saw the truth. It was in the way Pierce had smiled when he mentioned small gifts. It was in Caroline's avoidance when I asked about the reading clinic. It was in Aunt Lillian's note in the margin, "Hope you understand, dear," as if betrayal were something polite people could simply agree upon. I poured another glass of water and didn't drink it. My reflection in the kitchen window looked back at me, faint, doubled against the cityscape. A man with resources, experience and patience, being treated like an inconvenient footnote in a story he had funded. I had no one to blame but myself. I had let silence become my default. I had allowed their pageantry to grow unchecked because I believed the work was shield enough. And then came the flashbacks I couldn't control. Caroline, at 18, begging me to co-sign a loan so she could finish college when her father's business had faltered. I had done it without hesitation. She'd thanked me with a tearful phone call that ended with, "You always come through." She'd never mentioned it again. Pierce, in his first years as a hedge fund hopeful, had approached me for introductions. I had opened doors for him, not because I liked him, but because it was the expedient thing to do for the family's public face. He'd shaken my hand with practiced sincerity, and then later, in a board meeting, corrected me on terminology he had learned from the same people I'd introduced him to. Aunt Lillian, years ago, had once called me the sensible one. Back then, it sounded like trust. Now, it sounded like she'd chosen the word because expendable was too honest. I walked to my study. The desk was organized with the precision of someone who doesn't tolerate improvisation. On the top drawer, neatly tucked, were all the thank you cards, old foundation documents, handwritten notes from directors, and performance reports. I laid them out across the surface one by one, as if assembling evidence for a trial no one else would witness. The air smelled faintly of paper and old leather. Outside, a siren wailed and then faded, leaving behind the steady rhythm of the city. The weight of it all settled in not grief, not anger, but something colder, like a scale finally balanced after years of quiet tilting. I sat down, hands flat on the table. For years, I had convinced myself that staying silent was noble, that letting them have the spotlight was strategic, that the work mattered more than my name being mentioned. And for years, that had been true, until they mistook my silence for permission to erase me altogether. That was the humiliation, not the gala, not the letter, not the box with the blank star. It was realizing that my loyalty had made their betrayal easy. I stayed like that for hours, the city's night unfolding in layers outside my windows. My assistant texted me once about a logistics schedule. I ignored it. The world kept turning. Betrayal doesn't pause the machinery. It just sharpens your awareness of it. By dawn, the first light cut through the skyline like a blade. I didn't feel broken. I felt awake. I walked to the window, the streets below empty except for a lone delivery truck reversing into an alley, beeping steadily. It reminded me of my own business, how precision was built on understanding the quiet hours when no one else is watching. In those quiet hours, humiliation transformed. It lost its sting and hardened into something else. Clarity. A stillness that isn't defeat, but decision in disguise. The betrayal was complete. The fallout had landed. Now there was only one question left, echoing in the stillness like a slow metronome. What are you going to do about it? I didn't answer yet. Not aloud, but I knew the answer wouldn't be an emotional outburst. It wouldn't be a plea for recognition or an attempt to regain my seat at their table. It would be something they wouldn't see coming, because they had trained themselves not to see me at all, and that would be their mistake. There is a particular hour between night and morning when the city doesn't quite know what it is. It's no longer dark, but the light hasn't claimed it yet. I've always liked that hour. It's when deliveries arrive, newspapers hit doorsteps, and people who believe in order begin their day before chaos gets its chance. That's the hour I sat in my study 3 mornings after the letter awake, calm and thinking. Thinking has always been my currency. Emotions are expensive. They spend themselves too quickly. Strategy lasts. I started with a single question. What had they actually taken from me? Not money. I had more than I'd ever need. Not reputation. Mine was quiet but intact. Not power, because true power doesn't exist in speeches or magazine covers. It lives in infrastructure, in the contracts that outlast applause, in the clauses no one reads but everyone obeys. No, what they had taken was recognition of contribution acknowledgement. But acknowledgement is a shallow currency. I didn't need it back. I needed balance, the kind only truth can restore. So, I began listing truths. Truth. They had built their charity's image on optics, not outcomes. Truth. I had built its foundation literally and legally. Truth. There was a clause in our charter that required transparency between sponsorship narrative and programmatic reality. Truth. They had violated that clause the moment they reclassified funds and excluded active grant partners. Truth. Violations have consequences when you design the system correctly. That last truth calmed me. Because I pulled the original documents from my safe, a slim folder of crisp, unblemished paper. Each page was a part of a structure I'd written 15 years ago, designed to prevent corruption when optimism still outweighed cynicism. I had imagined these clauses as safeguards for others, not weapons for myself. But principles are neutral until someone gives them direction. As I read, my mind was already moving, mapping relationships, leverage points, liabilities. Every family operates on 2 economies, money and secrets. My relatives traded in both. I'd simply been their accountant. At 9:30 sharp, my phone buzzed. A message from Caroline. We'd love a brief statement of gratitude for the program booklet. Keep it under 150 words. Something inspiring. I stared at the message. The audacity was almost artful. I typed a reply. My gratitude is reserved for actions, not audiences. I'll submit neither. Then I deleted it. Silence is sharper when it's intentional. Instead, I archived the message, flagged it as Exhibit A, and turned my attention back to the system I had helped them build. Every transaction leaves a fingerprint. Every redirected dollar, every sponsorship adjustment, every streamlined fund carries metadata. Timestamps, signatures, approvals. And our foundation's transparency software, ironically, a system I had personally insisted on implementing, kept copies of all of it, including the transactions they thought they'd hidden under general fund realignment. I logged in. The interface was familiar. A network of folders, each labeled with polite bureaucratic euphemisms, impact reports, allocation notes, partnership outreach. The newest editions glowed with timestamps from the past 2 weeks. I opened one labeled Gala 24 Narratives. Inside was a memo from Pierce to the PR firm. Minimize mention of legacy donors whose contributions are under 7 figures. Focus on growth narrative, fresh energy, new partnerships. Adjust visuals accordingly. Under 7 figures. I almost laughed. They'd managed to transform decency into a disqualification. Scrolling further, I found the pivot point, the operational reallocation they'd hidden. They had pulled $480,000 from the literacy endowment into event experience costs. The justification read, enhancing donor immersion via narrative simulation. Narrative simulation. That was the phrase they'd used for champagne towers and augmented reality installations. Money meant for children's tutors had been redirected to project holograms of success. That was it. The pivot point. The betrayal beneath the betrayal. And like every pivot point, it could be reversed. I printed the document and placed it neatly on my desk. The printer's rhythmic hum felt almost ceremonial. Then I stood, walked to the window, and watched the morning thicken into gold between buildings. The city was waking. So was I. That afternoon, I visited the rival charity, the one across town that never made the magazines but always met its deadlines. They operated out of a converted firehouse. No marble floors, no valet parking, just the smell of coffee and determination. The director, a woman named Ruth, greeted me with ink-stained fingers and a half-buttoned cardigan. She looked like work itself, unimpressed by appearances, alert to reality. "You came in person," she said, surprised. "We don't get much of that from your side of town." "I needed to see where integrity lives," I replied. She blinked, studying me, trying to decide whether that was praise or poetry. "You're the one who helped us replace the van last year, right? The one with the typo in my thank you note?" "I remember," I said. She smiled, small and real. "We still talk about that. We've been trying to raise funds for another program, mobile literacy for rural areas. Not flashy, just necessary. Unflashy things tend to last," I said. "Tell me about it." We sat for an hour in her small office. No view, no assistant, just folders, schedules, and a corkboard covered with photographs of volunteers and children holding books. As she spoke, I listened not as a donor, but as a tactician. Every detail she shared was another coordinate in a map that was beginning to draw itself in my mind. When she finished, I asked, "What would you do with double your current budget?" Her eyebrows lifted. "I'd probably faint. Then hire twice as many reading coaches." "Why?" I smiled faintly. "Because you're about to." That evening, I transferred funds quietly, legally, efficiently. Every dollar that had been intended for programs through the Family Foundation was rerouted to Ruth's organization. Not withdrawn, redirected. The difference was crucial. The allocation was still within charter compliance, still fulfilling the covenant clause. But the recipient had changed. In place of one charity's excess, another's integrity would grow. It was elegant symmetry. I didn't feel vindictive. I felt precise. Every transaction had a timestamp. Every document a justification. I prepared a report detailing how the redirection aligned with the original programmatic intent. Nothing illegal, nothing emotional, just arithmetic with moral weight. I called my attorney, Thomas Whitfield, a man who understood that law was simply the language of restraint, written by those who could afford patience. "Thomas," I said, "I'll need you to review a reallocation report for compliance. It will reference Clause 7C of our charter. I want airtight documentation." He didn't ask why. Thomas was a man who understood that silence was sometimes the most expensive service. "Send it over," he said. "I'll have it notarized by morning." By nightfall, everything was in motion. Funds rerouted, documentation filed, compliance letters drafted. No one at the Family Foundation would notice until the gala's payment deadlines collided with missing deposits. By then, the stage would already be built, the press releases written, the guests confirmed. That's when optics become liabilities. Still, I wasn't ready to act. Strategy without timing is noise. I waited. In the days leading to the gala, Caroline sent another email blast to the board. Exciting news. Sponsorship confirmations complete. Looking forward to celebrating everyone's contributions. She attached the seating chart. My name was absent. It didn't matter. My contribution would speak a different language. The night before the gala, I attended the dress rehearsal uninvited, of course. I walked into the ballroom like a ghost inspecting its former life. Staff scurried between tables, arranging centerpieces of silver lilies and crystal. The air smelled like anticipation and self-importance. On the stage, technicians adjusted lights for a holographic display of constellations. The projection shimmered across the ceiling stars, forming the names of donors. My name was not among them. I stood in the back, unnoticed. It was almost poetic. The invisible architect watching his creation impersonate someone else's virtue. The irony was nearly perfect. Nearly. Caroline walked past, clipboard in hand, giving notes to the event coordinator. Her voice carried the tone of someone who has never known consequences. "Make sure the sponsor wall cycles every 10 seconds. We want all logos visible during the toast." I watched her for a long moment, not with anger, but with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing a failed experiment. I'd once believed family loyalty was a form of legacy. Now I saw it for what it was, a fragile contract written in invisible ink, legible only until the lights change. When I returned home, I stood before the window again, the city glittering beneath me. I poured a drink, not to celebrate, but to mark the shift. There's a point when thought becomes decision, when strategy ceases to be abstract and becomes motion. That point had arrived. I took out the printed memo about donor reclassification. I read it once more, then slid it into an envelope with the notarized reallocation report. On the front, I wrote 3 words in clean black ink to the board. Confidential. I didn't need to attach a message. The contents would write it for me. At dawn, a courier delivered it to the foundation office. By noon, it would be opened. By evening, their empire would begin to tilt. The breaking point wasn't anger. It was geometry. And I had finally found my angle. The morning after the courier left my building, I woke to a city still pretending it could hide its noise. You can tell how honest a neighborhood is by how it sounds before 8 a.m., before the horns and chatter. before ambition starts running its daily laps. Mine hummed with a certain kind of restraint, like even the air knew something was about to be set in motion. I brewed coffee I wouldn't finish. Halfway through the first sip, my phone lit up with messages from the Foundation's board thread, a storm pretending to be a drizzle. Words like confusion, urgent, and funding discrepancy appeared in polite sequence. Caroline hadn't written yet, which told me she was still gathering a narrative. And Pierce's silence meant he was waiting to see which way the wind was blowing before pretending to have predicted it. The plan was working, but only because I had designed it to mimic failure before success. People like my relatives understand triumph. They cannot read quiet. I had built this plan not overnight, but in fragments of patience spread across years. Every contract clause, every data access protocol, every insistence on donor verification audits, those had all been puzzle pieces for a day like this. I never wrote rules to prevent chaos. I wrote them to shape it when it arrived. The reallocation of funds had triggered an automatic audit notification. Legally, it wasn't an accusation, just a procedural alert that someone with authority had changed the financial flow of a registered endowment. But perception is faster than legality, and perception is what Caroline feared most. The notice had been sent not just to the internal board, but per my original system's design to every institutional partner affiliated with the Foundation's trust. Banks, auditors, partner NGOs, and yes, the IRS compliance desk. All automated, all traceable to an action perfectly within my rights. By noon, the gala's first crisis meeting had begun. I didn't attend, of course. I didn't need to. I already knew how it would unfold. Pierce would start with denial, then pivot to annoyance. Caroline would attempt control soft tones, corporate optimism. Let's not panic. Aunt Lillian would insist on optics management. And somewhere between those lines, their financial director, a thin man named Donnelly, would clear his throat and say the words they'd all pretend not to hear. Until this is resolved, event vendors can't process payments from restricted funds. The ballroom they'd already rented, the catering, the digital constellation display, the PR firm, the photographers, all of it, frozen. The beauty of bureaucracy is that it obeys no one once it starts breathing. I spent that afternoon at my office, a quiet floor in a logistics building on the river. My employees thought I was simply reviewing quarterly contracts. In truth, I was reviewing the final sequence of a performance years in rehearsal. My assistant, Nora, appeared at the door with her tablet. "You asked for updates on the Foundation's transactions?" "Yes," she handed me a printout. "You were right. Their accounts are temporarily locked, pending audit verification. They can't release any new payments for 72 hours. "Thank you, Nora." She hesitated. "Sir, is everything all right? You've been distant." "I'm fine," I said. And I was fine in the way a blade is fine before it draws its first clean line. That evening, I made 3 phone calls, each one precisely timed, each to a different person who believed they were the first to know. First, I called Thomas Whitfield, my attorney. "Thomas, you'll soon get a call from the Foundation. They'll try to challenge the reallocation," he chuckled softly. "And they'll fail. Just remind them of the bylaws. Clause 7C authorizes programmatic transfer in case of narrative misalignment." "I wrote that clause for you myself," he said. "They won't like it." "They don't have to," I replied. Next, I called Ruth, the director of the rival charity, now holding every dollar they'd planned to show off. "I expect you'll be receiving inquiries," I told her. "Inquiries?" "Yes, from journalists, possibly from donors. Handle them as you see fit, but stay factual. Transparency is your best armor." She hesitated. "Are you in trouble?" "Not at all," I said. "I'm simply moving the light to where it belongs." The last call was to an old journalist friend, Adrian Soto, one of the few who still treated investigative reporting as an act of integrity rather than survival. "I've sent you something," I said. "An internal memo and 2 authorization documents. Cross-check them before printing anything. No names from me. Just facts," he paused. "What's this about?" "Charity," I said. "The kind that begins at home and sometimes needs to be disinfected." He laughed quietly. "You've always been a poet with a knife." "I prefer the term surgeon." 2 days before the gala, the foundation released an internal memo to the board claiming a temporary technical issue. I received a copy accidentally, perhaps, and read it like a man watching actors forget their lines. "Our main sponsor has experienced unforeseen banking delays, but rest assured, the event will proceed as planned." Unforeseen. Banking delays. It almost moved me, their devotion to euphemism. That same evening, I visited the gala venue, again not to gloat, but to listen. The staff rehearsed seating cues, light changes, music transitions. The head coordinator, unaware of who I was, mentioned that half their deposits hadn't cleared. "We'll just bill post-event," she said nervously. "They're good for it," I nodded. "Of course they are." Outside, the night air tasted of coming irony. The next morning, Adrian's article went live. The headline was deliberate, not sensational. "Misalignment in Major Foundation Raises Questions on Charity Optics and Transparency." It contained just enough detail to ignite curiosity without naming villains. It quoted anonymous internal sources, Thomas's legal filings, public record transfers, Ruth's confirmation of receipt. It praised the decision to redirect funds toward direct service literacy programs, previously underfunded by administrative priorities. It was, by every measure, unassailable. The board thread exploded. I watched it unfold like a symphony written for panic. Caroline's messages were curt, peppered with phrases like containment strategy and temporary narrative pivot. Pierce wrote, "We should control the messaging." Aunt Lillian wrote, "Who leaked this?" I didn't reply. Instead, I sent one final email, time-stamped at 5:55 a.m., a number I chose intentionally. Change disguised as coincidence. Subject: Clarification of funds, dear Board, per our founding charter. Reallocation was executed in full compliance with the endowment's integrity clause. The literacy programs now receiving support were originally funded by our organization and continue to serve the same purpose. No assets have been withdrawn, only restored to alignment. Respectfully, I clicked send and let silence take the wheel. Gala night arrived with its usual choreography of arrogance. Black cars lined the avenue, glittering gowns brushed past doormen, and somewhere above it all, Caroline's perfect voice rehearsed charm in the mirror. I didn't go. I didn't need to. At 8 p.m., as guests raised their champagne flutes under the projection of glittering constellations, a staff member whispered something to Caroline. She froze mid-sentence. The lights kept moving. The cameras kept recording. The main sponsor's payment had bounced. Twice. Their accounts were on hold pending verification. The entire event's funding architecture collapsed in real-time. Invoices declined. Catering suspended. Press releases withdrawn. Guests began to murmur, then whisper. Pierce tried to salvage the moment with laughter. "A small technical issue, folks," he said into the microphone. But donors are allergic to uncertainty. Within minutes, the crowd began to thin. Across town, Ruth's organization posted a quiet update. Thanks to a generous and timely realignment of community grants, our literacy expansion program is fully funded. The mobile vans roll out Monday. The timing was perfect. I watched the live stream from home, glass in hand, the volume low. The projection of stars behind Caroline flickered, then went dark. The feed cut out. It was beautiful. At 11 that night, my phone rang. Caroline. I let it ring 4 times before answering. "Why?" she demanded, her voice trembling with outrage dressed as heartbreak. "Why what? You don't act innocent. You rerouted the funds. You humiliated us. Do you have any idea what you've done?" "Yes," I said calmly. "I've restored the truth. This was supposed to be our moment." "It was," I agreed. "And it was honest, for exactly as long as you let it be." She exhaled sharply, trying to regain control. "You've ruined your reputation, too. Everyone will know." "Good," I said. "Let them. The people worth knowing will understand." And I ended the call. For the first time in years, the silence that followed didn't feel heavy. It felt earned. The plan was complete. The justice was in motion. And yet, I knew the true reckoning hadn't even begun. It wouldn't come from me anymore. It would come from consequence, the one force no amount of optics can control. Revenge, I've learned, doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need a stage or a raised voice. True revenge moves like time, quiet, steady, irreversible. The night of the IE Gala was one of those crisp Manhattan evenings that makes the city look expensive even to itself. The kind of night my relatives believed was proof that destiny favored them. I didn't attend, of course. I preferred to witness it from a vantage point worthy of the occasion, not from a velvet chair beneath chandeliers, but from the comfort of my office, 28 floors above the Hudson, where the glass reflected the glow of the city back at itself like a confession. I poured a drink, no ice, no toast. Just amber calm. The live stream link was pinned to the Foundation's website, framed by the tagline they'd chosen months ago. "Lighting the way to tomorrow." I clicked play. The broadcast opened with sweeping shots of the ballroom, a forest of glitter and light. The orchestra played a delicate waltz, while waiters moved like precision instruments between tables. Guests in black and silver attire applauded as the camera panned to the stage. Caroline stood there, radiant and rehearsed, her smile the kind that money buys and mirrors confirm. "Good evening," she began. "Tonight we gather, not just to celebrate generosity, but to become a part of something greater." I'd written her first speech years ago. She was still using fragments of it now. Pierce stepped forward, the consummate showman. He thanked sponsors, listed partnerships, and gestured toward the projection of the donor constellation wall behind them. Dozens of glowing names shimmered across the ballroom ceiling like a digital aurora. The guests gasped and lifted their phones, chasing immortality through pixels, but I noticed it first, the slight flicker in the projection feed. A single constellation blinked out, then returned, then another. The lighting operator looked panicked, whispering into his headset. Caroline kept smiling. Pierce chuckled nervously. "Looks like our stars are a bit shy tonight," he said. Laughter rippled, thin and polite, and then the sponsor logo at the center of the screen, the presenting partner that had replaced my fund, vanished entirely. A blank circle pulsed in its place like an empty heartbeat. In the control booth, the technician was reading the alert I had quietly set up weeks earlier. The sponsorship account had failed authentication. The system's display protocol, written by me long ago, automatically removed invalid contributors from the visual feed. The rule was simple. If the money doesn't match the mission, the light goes dark. The room began to shift. Not visibly yet, but atmospherically. Conversations faltered. Someone at the front table leaned toward Caroline and whispered. Her smile stiffened. 22 p.m. The reversal A-man from the event management firm walked briskly onto the stage, trying to hand Caroline a note. Cameras caught it. She glanced down, eyes scanning, her hand trembling just slightly. I turned up the volume. "Unfortunately," she said, voice faltering for the first time, "due to an unforeseen technical error, some donor data has not synced, but donors don't like hearing the word error. It doesn't fit in their vocabulary. They donate to control chaos, not witness it." A murmur began, spreading like a quiet storm. Tables of executives whispered, glances exchanged like currency. Then, from the side entrance, the press arrived. A few local journalists had been invited to cover the philanthropic milestone. But one of them, Adrian, wasn't there for celebration. His credentials had been accepted like everyone else's, but his badge hid a small recording device. He stood near the back, capturing footage as confusion unfolded on stage. 8:35 p.m. The collapse, the orchestra stopped mid-song. The projection froze. Pierce tried to salvage the moment, stepping to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we are committed to transparency and excellence. Tonight, despite some technical setbacks, our mission—" The microphone cut out. A second later, the ballroom's screens flickered back to life, not with the donor wall, but with a rolling document feed. The audience fell silent as text appeared in glowing white letters. Foundation audit. Notice, immediate review of sponsorship allocations and fund realignment. Issued 8:15 p.m. Eastern Time, authorized by Thomas Whitfield, legal counsel of record. Underneath, another line appeared. Funds previously allocated to restricted accounts have been redirected to programmatic use under Charter Clause 7C. Integrity of mission enforcement. Collective gasp swept through the crowd. The words redirected and enforcement hit like an aria written in law. Caroline turned toward Pierce, her face blanching under the lights. Aunt Lillian rose halfway from her chair, her pearl necklace catching the glare like a noose of light. Someone shouted, "What does that mean?" Someone else murmured, "Was the money moved?" And then, inevitably, a guest stood and said the sentence every empire fears. "Is this in the papers already?" 8:41 p.m. Public exposure. Adrian didn't have to do much. The chaos spoke for itself. He filmed the reactions, the panic, the whispered accusations. A few guests stormed out, phones pressed to their ears, calling assistants, lawyers, bankers. Caroline tried to regain control. "Please, everyone, this is just a misunderstanding." But the crowd wasn't listening. Behind her, the screens continued to scroll. Financial terms, clauses, references to redirected endowments, all precise, all factual. None of it was a hack. It was simply the system doing what it was designed to do. In the control room, I imagined the technician staring helplessly at a terminal, running my old code, a subroutine labeled Auto Disclose on Audit. I had written it years ago for compliance assurance. It was never meant to embarrass anyone. But honesty, like light, doesn't choose where it shines. Within minutes, half the guests had left their seats. The orchestra quietly packed up. A CNN affiliate reporter in the crowd was already calling her editor. Caroline's voice cracked as she tried to speak over the growing noise. The Foundation remains committed to. The microphone died again. The silence that followed was merciless. 9:05 p.m. The phone call, my phone vibrated. "I didn't need to check the name." "Tell me you didn't do this," Caroline said. Her voice was trembling, but anger was still fighting for space. "I didn't do anything," I replied. "The system did. You programmed it." "Yes," I said, "to ensure integrity." "You removed integrity." The system noticed. "You've destroyed us," she said. "No," I said. "I simply removed your camouflage. The truth did the rest." She went quiet for a long moment. I could hear faint voices in the background, reporters, guests, chaos disguised as order unraveling. "What happens now?" she whispered. "That depends on whether you can still tell the difference between reputation and redemption," I said. "If you can, maybe there's something left to rebuild." Then I ended the call. 9:30 p.m. Chatrines. The reversal becomes complete. By the time the gala ended, every news outlet in the city had picked up Adrian's footage. The headlines weren't cruel. They were factual. But facts can be fatal when your life is built on appearance, transparency, glitch at gala raises, questions of mismanagement, starry charity event, ends in audit, drama, funds redirected to underserved literacy, programs. The final headline was the one that mattered. It made me smile. At 10:15, Ruth called. Her voice was calm but breathless. "They're reaching out to us. Reporters, donors. The attention is unreal. We've never had this kind of spotlight." "Enjoy it," I said. "Just don't let it change you." "Why did you do this?" she asked. "Because you deserved the resources more than they deserved the praise." The next morning by dawn, social media was ablaze. Influencers who had attended the gala were posting stories about unprecedented transparency and foundations learning accountability. People love moral theater, especially when it's not their own. Caroline released a statement mid-morning. "We applaud the reallocation of resources toward programs that serve immediate community needs. Our organization stands committed to learning, adapting, and continuing our mission with humility." It was a public surrender disguised as diplomacy. A decent move. She'd survive it in time. Pierce wouldn't. His fund's investors would see the audit notice, the headlines, the faint whiff of impropriety. His empire ran on confidence. Confidence doesn't forgive association with scandal. Aunt Lillian, I heard, had gone to Palm Beach for her health. In our family, that phrase meant exile. And me, I went back to work. The logistics firm didn't pause. The trucks kept running, the contracts kept signing. My world had always been built on systems that function even when people don't. At noon, I walked down to the Riverside Cafe below my office and ordered black coffee. Adrian was already there, waiting. "You orchestrated that like a symphony," he said, sliding his phone across the table with the article on screen. "You realize this story's going national?" "I'm aware. Want credit?" "No," I said. "I want distance," he smiled. "You'll get both." That night, I opened the same file that had begun it all covenants. I read the words again. All actions and allocations must reflect the spirit of service and truth above narrative. I had kept my promise. To the law. To the principle. To myself, revenge wasn't about pain. It was about correction. I hadn't burned anything. I had simply turned the lights back on. Outside, the city glittered, as if applauding itself for surviving another day. But in the quiet of my office, the applause didn't matter. The victory didn't need witnesses. I had given them what they asked for. A story worth remembering. They just didn't realize they weren't the heroes anymore. When the dust settles, truth makes no sound. It simply remains, like the outline of something that used to cast a shadow. A week passed before I realized how completely the storm had finished its work. In the days after the gala, headlines had multiplied like weeds, first local, then national, then international. The language softened with distance, miscommunication, structural oversight, unintentional reallocation. But those words could no longer bury what had already been unearthed. Caroline's foundation, our foundation, as they once called it now, lived under the bright, unsparing light of scrutiny. The donors who once fought for front-row tables began speaking through lawyers instead of publicists. Partnerships evaporated. Invitations rescinded themselves. The gala photos vanished from social media feeds, replaced by polite statements and digital silence. Yet, amid that silence, something else grew, the sound of authentic work continuing elsewhere. Ruth's literacy vans began their routes the following Monday, as promised. The first stop was a rural district outside Albany. I watched a small clip on the news. Children holding books, volunteers unloading boxes, sunlight falling across concrete like grace. No speeches, no chandeliers, no stage lights, just the sound of pages turning. That was the kind of applause I could live with. By the second week, Caroline had stepped down temporarily from her role as chairwoman. Her public resignation letter thanked our devoted supporters for their understanding during this transition of transparency. It was a carefully written piece of theater, polished, remorseful, utterly hollow. Pierce resigned soon after, citing a need to focus on family, which was ironic, considering he'd been one of the first to betray his own. His investors followed suit, withdrawing quietly, afraid of headlines that used the word mismanagement. As for Aunt Lillian, she retreated to her Palm Beach home, where she could pretend that exile was merely early retirement. Her assistant sent a short message. She hopes you find peace with yourself. I found the phrase amusing. People like her confuse peace with silence. They believe quiet means everything's forgiven. It doesn't. It means the noise they made is finally irrelevant. I didn't reply. My lawyer, Thomas, called one morning to give an update. Everything's closed cleanly, he said. No lawsuits, no inquiries aimed at you. They've accepted the charter's authority. They had to, I said. They wrote their empire on the paper I designed. He hesitated. You know, most men in your position would have gone for blood. Press interviews, defamation suits, public shaming. But you, I don't chase ruins, I interrupted. I let gravity finish what it starts, Thomas chuckled. Still, I hope you sleep better now. I don't sleep better, I said. I sleep accurately. He didn't understand what I meant, but that was all right. Few people ever do. That evening, I reopened the ledger where I'd tracked every transaction of the foundation for 15 years. Each line was a story of sacrifice, of intention. I drew a single black line under the last entry, the reallocation to Ruth's charity, and wrote, in small letters beneath it, balance restored. I didn't feel victorious, just aligned. There's a difference. 2 months later, I visited Ruth's office, the converted firehouse, where integrity still had a pulse. The walls were brighter now, painted by volunteers. The once empty shelves were lined with supplies. A whiteboard near the entrance listed new expansion routes for the literacy vans. Ruth met me with ink on her hands again. You caused a storm, she said. I redirected weather, I replied. She smiled at that. You know, the kids ask about you. We told them a benefactor helped make this happen. They call you the silent sponsor. Keep it that way, I said. The less they know about me, the better they'll remember the books. She looked at me for a long moment. You really don't want credit? I already got it, I said, glancing around the room. You're still here. That's credit enough. Before I left, she handed me something wrapped in brown paper. It's from one of the students, she said. He wanted to thank you. When I got home, I unwrapped it. It was a drawing, crude, colorful, honest. A bus with books flying out the windows like birds. At the bottom, in uneven handwriting, thank you for the words. I pinned it to my wall, next to the charter clause that had started it all. For once, both felt equally sacred. Family doesn't disappear. It recalibrates. Caroline called me 3 months later. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity outweighed fatigue. She sounded smaller than before. I wanted to apologize, she said softly. Not for the gala that's just a symptom. For all the years I thought your silence meant weakness. And what do you think it meant now? I asked. She paused. Strength. Maybe guilt, too. The kind that builds quietly until it becomes architecture. I said nothing. I've started volunteering at one of the local programs, she continued. Ruth's organization. They didn't recognize me at first. I liked that. That admission surprised me. Maybe there's hope for you yet, I said. She gave a sad laugh. Maybe, but hope doesn't clean a reputation. No, I said. It cleans the soul. The reputation follows when it's ready. When we hung up, I realized that was the first conversation we'd ever had without pretense. I never spoke to Pierce again. His world operated on velocity once momentum stopped. So did his meaning. As for Aunt Lillian, she sent a holiday card that arrived with no return address. On the front was a dove. Inside, peace. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was acknowledgement. For her, that was nearly miraculous. People often mistake justice for satisfaction. They believe that balancing the scales feels like triumph. It doesn't. It feels like silence returning to a room that had been too loud for too long. There were moments in the weeks that followed when I wondered if I had gone too far. Not legally, the law was on my side, but morally. Whether redirecting their downfall instead of confronting them face to face made me a coward or a craftsman. I walked through Central Park one evening, cold air threading through the trees, and found my answer in the rhythm of my steps. You can't argue with someone committed to illusion. You can only remove the illusion and let them meet themselves. Justice isn't about revenge. Revenge seeks applause. Justice seeks balance. I hadn't destroyed my family. I'd revealed them. And in doing so, I'd revealed myself too, the part of me that had grown tired of building empires for other people's mirrors. Months passed. The story faded from headlines, as all stories eventually do. A new scandal replaced ours. A new charity rose to prominence, and society found another moral to consume. But some changes stay even after the world forgets. Ruth's program expanded to 3 more states. They invited me to the opening ceremony of their new headquarters. I declined, but I sent a note. The brightest light is the one that doesn't know it's shining. She replied simply, "We'll keep the lights on." I spent more time in the quiet places reading, walking, writing notes that no one would ever read. The work at my logistics company ran smoother than ever. Efficiency loves clarity, and I had finally found mine. One night, as I sat by the window overlooking the river, I thought about my mother. I imagined her at that old chipped kitchen table, grading papers, believing that effort mattered even if no one noticed. She would have understood what I'd done. She might not have approved, but she would have recognized the intention. To make the world align with the truth, even for a moment. I whispered into the empty room. I kept the promise. The glass reflected me back, older, calmer, unrecognizable from the man who once needed their approval. People often write about revenge as if it's an explosion, loud, destructive, final. But the most elegant revenge is restoration. It's the act of returning something stolen, not to the thief, but to the rightful owner. My family had stolen the meaning of charity. I returned it to its origin. The difference between revenge and justice is motive. Revenge says, "You hurt me, and I want you to feel it." Justice says, "You broke something, and I want it fixed." The night the gala collapsed, I realized I hadn't wanted them to suffer. I'd wanted them to understand, and perhaps, deep down, to remember who they once were before greed learned their names. Sometimes you don't destroy your enemies. You educate them. 6 months later, the foundation rebranded itself. New leadership, new mission statement, smaller board. They invited me to return as an honorary consultant. I declined. The invitation ended with, "We hope to rebuild trust." I smiled reading it. Trust isn't rebuilt. It's earned in silence and proven in storms. That evening, I archived every document related to the old foundation. The sound of each digital file sliding into storage felt ceremonial. When I was done, I shut down the computer and opened the window. The city hummed, indifferent, eternal. There's freedom in anonymity, power in stepping back. I no longer needed their stage. The real work had already begun somewhere else in quiet classrooms, in the pages of books held by small hands, in the soft hum of mobile vans driving through back roads at dawn. That was my legacy. Not the gala, not the press, not even the revenge, just the work. Sometimes justice doesn't look like victory. It looks like peace you can finally believe in. I still receive letters from Ruth's staff, brief updates, photos, occasional thank yous. One arrived last week, a snapshot of a little girl standing by one of the vans, holding a sign that read, Reading makes me brave. I looked at it for a long time before placing it beside the child's drawing. Two artifacts of truth small, unpretentious, eternal. I used to think wealth was the ability to build what others can't. Now I know it's the ability to walk away when the building is done. The world doesn't reward quiet correction. It rewards spectacle. But sometimes the quiet wins anyway. It just takes longer for everyone else to notice. I often think about that final night, the ballroom, the silence, the blank stars on the ceiling. They thought darkness was failure. It was just honesty reclaiming its space. And when I think of them now, I don't feel anger. Only distance, the kind that keeps a clean horizon between you and what you've outgrown. I end my nights the same way. One glass of water, a reflection in the window, the hum of the city beyond. No guilt, no applause, just equilibrium. And sometimes I ask myself, if given the chance, would I do it again? The answer comes as quietly as the act itself. Yes, but not out of vengeance, out of symmetry. Because in the end, all I did was fulfill the very promise the foundation had forgotten, to keep the lights aligned with the truth. And so, I leave you with this question, not as a confession, but as a mirror. What would you have done in my place? Comment below. Like this video if the story spoke to you, and subscribe for more stories where justice doesn't shout, it simply arrives.